Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, November 7th edition of the Cluster API subgroup meeting as part of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Let's see, today, the first thing I stuck on the agenda was we got a notification from GitHub, or maybe just I got it because I think it only goes to administrators of the repository, that we have a security vulnerability in our repo. And I poked at this a little bit last night, and it looks like one of the dependencies that was introduced when our Gitbook PR merged needs to be updated to a new version. So I put some notes in the issue there and assigned it to David. I don't know if you saw that. Excellent. He's giving me the thumbs up. So it suggested a fix in that screenshot that I took. I wasn't sure exactly how to apply that fix. I thought you might have more information. Okay, so fix incoming soonish, hopefully.
Well, we're gonna put it.
Thank you. Excellent. All right, next, Marco, do you have an action item from the provisioning doc proposal?
Yes, we have went today through the document and left and answered comments on what is left so far. We are going to leave it like that for like 3 days or so. And then after that, we are going to create a PR with a markdown file to Cluster API repository. So this is a sort of final call if somebody wants to go once again through it and check is it okay.
Great. Thank you for bringing that back to everyone's attention. I know that I'd had it on my list of things to go back and look at and had not gotten to it yet. So I will definitely try to take a look in the next couple of days. Hopefully other people have a chance to as well. All right, Alvaro. During the CRD move, most tests for machine set and machine deployment controller were deleted. Was this intentional? No, that was not intentional. That must have been an oversight. I don't think Phil would have removed tests on purpose. We should definitely put them back in or something that replaces that functionality. I guess one interesting question here is whether have the actual controllers regressed in functionality. Did we break them as well by taking away the tests, or do we think they still work and the tests are just missing to make sure they continue working?
I can tell because, well, the tests don't exist anymore, so maybe it still works as a test, maybe it doesn't. Yeah, but one thing I noticed when looking into that is that apparently we don't have a fake client set anymore because the kubelet assumes we are always going to use this test API server and etcd, but those tests that were removed actually rely on the fake client set and checking which actions we're taking and so on. So yeah. I think that could have been one reason why it happened.
Okay, I know I fixed up some of the tests during the migration that were using the fake client to instead use an actual dynamic client, like you said, pointed at sort of a fake API server etcd, or maybe it's a real one that gets spun up as part of testing. But you can actually use a real client to verify the behavior also, right? You can, in a sort of a sandbox environment, create and modify and delete resources and verify that the side effects are what you expect.
Yeah, but I cannot check the individual calls, right? From a fake client set, you can see something like 3 updates calls were made, something like that. And from an actual API server, I don't get that anymore. I just see the results.
Okay, I think this would be a good question to ask Phil or Sunil from the KubeBuilder side and see if they have a recommendation of how to do testing at that level now that there's no fake client. Can you, if you haven't already, can you open an issue so that we can plus them in and I can poke them about it?
Yes, I will do so.
Cool. Excellent. Yes, and it would be good to get tests put back in place so that we can verify that the controllers are working properly. I took a couple of PR, or did you have anything else for that one before I move on? Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Okay. I took a couple of PRs in here next that are probably worth talking about. So the first one is Jason's, which is to switch our YAML dependency from Sam's repo to the Kubernetes fork. I was just curious if there was an update on that. I know that DIMS has been doing a lot of work on the main repo to try and switch it over to a fork, and we were sort of waiting for that to land. And I haven't been paying attention, so I don't know where we are, if we're unblocked or not.
Yeah, we should be completely unblocked now. There was a new release cut of the forked version that sits on sig.k8.io, and there was some issue with the test harness that we had. One of the images that we were using was using Go 1.9, so the test info changes are in. This should be ready to merge. It's more of a let's get this over with in advance so that when we update to a later version of KubeBuilder, we can then officially drop the other YAML package from our dependency chain.
Right. So this just switches over. I think I looked at PR, the one place in our code that we explicitly were importing Sam's YAML package, but doesn't clean out the vendor dependency because we still rely on KubeBuilder. Right. Yeah,
exactly. And it looks like the upstream change is going to land with 1.13. So once we eventually update to a version of KubeBuilder that's based off of 1.13, then that vendor dependency should drop off.
Of course, it'll be harder to tell at that point since we'll update so many things at once. It'll just be a wash of vendor updates, right?
Yeah. On the plus side, using the fork does give us the ability to do better validation on YAML during marshalling and unmarshalling as well, or during unmarshalling, so that we can actually validate and verify, additional fields if we chose to want to take advantage of that feature.
Cool. Awesome. So it sounds like we're unblocked at this point, and we should go ahead and try to get that one in. Okay, so the next one I stuck in here was the provider ID and machine status. So this came up at the end of last week's call, and we kind of ran out of time while discussing it, so I wanted to bring it back up. The original proposal was to add a provider ID as part of the autoscaler integration, and I think there was quite a bit of pushback to doing it for that reason, because the KEP for autoscaler integration hasn't merged, and we haven't really determined exactly what the autoscaler integration would look like. On the other hand, multiple people said that they still wanted to add this field, but not because of the autoscaler, but in particular, it would allow us to directly track through the machine controller or actuator the individual identity of a cloud resource that we had provisioned, which makes it easier in terms of bookkeeping. So I think with the provider status, we could do it there, right? We could put this into the provider specific parts if we just care about it from the actuator point of view. But if it's something that every single provider would add for bookkeeping, then it makes sense to consider putting it in as a top level field that everybody would just have access to, and we wouldn't have to re-implement in every provider. So I wanted to sort of reopen the discussion here, and it sounded like from what I was hearing that we should not merge this PR for the autoscaler work, but that people were interested in merging it for other reasons, and to just sort of continue that conversation and see, or do people think we should merge this PR now, or should we be waiting?
This is the conversion to field?
This is number 565. So this is adding a provider ID, which is an optional string in the machine status.
Wouldn't that also, it's more than machine status though. It would percolate through your cluster configuration all the way through down to potentially the other sub elements. Because it was partially for inbound on creation if you had many controller. The original conversation piece that we had last week was that on inbound, we were talking about annotation versus field, and when the other controllers could ignore if they were all within a single meta control plane, they could ignore the other providers.
So I think that was a separate discussion that spawned off of it, Tim. This is specifically just about adding a field referencing the provider ID as part of the high-level machine status instead of being implemented individually by all of the different provider statuses.
Yeah, but I think you need to percolate it through, right? Like if you're going to have a provider ID, it makes a ton of sense to have it be a field throughout the separate substructs.
So this provider ID was specifically for an ID referencing the individual created machine instance and not related to the provider implementation itself, per se.
Okay. I get you.
Yeah, this is in the status part of the machine. So the idea would be that you create a VM on AWS, and Amazon gives you back a unique ID for that VM, and you stick that into the machine status. Actually, it's not actually that. And I think I put a note on the PR. What we discussed was the kubelet reports back a provider-specific identifier. And this would be, we want to put the same identifier in the machine status of the kubelet report back, because that helps us tie together the machine and the node.
Yeah, but I think this limitation was mentioned or intention because of cluster autoscaler, and at least the result of the current discussion is that we shouldn't merge it because of autoscaler, but for different reasons, which would then mean that this expectation wouldn't be there, right?
Say that second part one more time. I agree with the first part. We shouldn't merge it because of cluster autoscaler. And you said, but, and I'm not sure I understood exactly what you said on the second.
Yes, so the reason why it had to be the same as the reference on the node object is because of cluster autoscaler. So if that is not the reason anymore, it can be something else.
Okay, so you're saying that having it match exactly what the kubelet reports back is what the autoscaler folks wanted, which we don't necessarily care about, at least not right now. So for now, if we had a provider ID field in machine status, the actuator could put whatever it wanted in that field for bookkeeping purposes to tie that machine to the underlying infrastructure that it had provisioned.
Yes, exactly that.
Excellent, cool.
So one question on there, like who would be responsible for populating this provider ID in the status? Is it gonna be like the actuator code that probably will find out the ID and then put it in there? Like who? Is that the answer? Like the machine actuator, for example, for individual provider would populate that?
I think it would have to be, since it's a provider specific field. I don't see how the generic code would have a way to extract that. The actuator would either have to return it to the generic code and have the generic code set it, or the actuator would set it directly.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, just confirming, Prem, because you already mentioned that this might be the provider ID that the kubelet might also report. So if that were the case, then there's probably a different mechanism as well that one could detect and then get it. So, okay, that's fine. I mean, I think makes sense if the machine actuator is putting that provider ID. In fact, I think just on a side note, currently at least for example, the vSphere provider implementation, we kind of enhance this spec for the machine to keep track of like the underlying ID, so that in the actuator code, for example, we can easily verify that. So if this becomes in the machine status, that would be great. Although one note that I might want to make is, if it is put in the status, it makes the that particular value not portable, especially if you were to do you want to do a pivot, then that status will not go over with it. So that's something you might want to think about depending on the different use cases, I guess.
I'll say that one more time. So when you say if you want to do a pivot, that it wouldn't carry over. So if I have a controller that is managing a machine and it knows the provider ID for that machine, and I basically want to transfer ownership of that machine from the controller that's maybe running in the Bootstrap cluster to a controller that's running inside the cluster. wouldn't the provider ID for that machine be the same because that controller is basically taking over ownership?
No, it will be the same. What I meant is, like, for example, the way we do the pivot today, we kind of literally take the output of, like, do a, let's say, kubectl get machine minus o yaml and get the output, remove the reference, and then we put it over, right? In a very generic sense. When you do that, when you create that object on the target side, the status will be ignored because it only takes care of the internal part, not the status. So anything that you want to pack into the status, keep in mind that will be lost on the target side, and the provider and the actuator and or controller on the target end will have to repopulate that ID again if it really wants to use it. I mean, this is primarily because we kind of did something similar within the purview of the provider specific part in the status, but then we realized that this would be the problem, and we basically switched as a solution. We switched to enriching the like the spec itself to have that reference so that it can be portable, essentially.
That is a really interesting point because it's in the status. When you try to create it in the new cluster, it'll just be ignored. So your solution was to put it into the spec instead of the status for that reason?
Yeah, so what we did essentially is, like for the vSphere Pro Cloud provider specific implementation, the provider spec, we basically added an additional field like a machine reference, machine ref, which is essentially an opaque string for us, at least at the provider level inside it. But then that is what we populate, and that is what we use. For example, if once we identified the underlying infrastructure and the unique identification of that VM, then that's what we put in there, and that becomes now a portable blob that can actually go along with that definition to the target cluster if you were to do a pivot, and then you don't lose that information in the process, which otherwise you would in the status.
Okay, and is the behavior if that field is set on a machine that the actuator assumes that it's basically adopting something that has that identifier?
Right. So essentially what happens is, in the way at least we have in the vSphere Cloud Provider implementation, is the exists method, for example, it looks in for that reference. If it exists, then it actually goes and verifies if that reference is actually valid in the underlying provider, like infrastructure. And if it is, then it returns, yes, it exists, and it doesn't do anything more. So that way it kind of avoids the recreation of that resource whatsoever again.
Okay, and it's a little bit of an edge case, but if somebody, like if I manually set that field to a value and posted a machine,
Yes.
would you notice that that value was incorrect and like basically clear it out, create a machine and replace it? Or would you say that's an invalid spec that you've created, that machine doesn't exist, and just basically throw it into error state?
So actually that's a specific use case that actually, for one of the product that I'm working on kind of utilizes that fact itself. So the idea is you create the master, let's say, for us, for example, for vSphere, you just have the one easy mechanism of deploying a VM is, or a system is, like you have an OVF that is an artifact that you just deploy, right? So one of the things that we are trying to do is you deploy this OVF, and when you power it on, it starts up as a single node master, but of course not created by Cluster API, primarily because it was just manually deployed by the user, right? But now we kind of backtrack and we say, okay, let's figure out what the identification is, fill back the spec for it, and let Cluster API record getting created, so that now the cluster controller and the actuator assumes the responsibility of that, because now it can actually validate that more. So even though it's a slightly different use case, but it actually works nicely as well. So one distinct feature that you could imagine with this is, tomorrow if you were to say, let's say some sort of an import, like I created from a provider, I created a different VM of my own in my own way, and I just want that to be added or consumed by the Cluster API for bookkeeping or whatever basic provisioning purposes, right? Not provision it, but just to make sure that it's under its umbrella, so to speak. So that could be another use case that could come out of this. Not directly intentional, but as a side benefit of it.
Okay, so basically, if you set that, you're basically saying, please adopt the machine that has this identifier, effectively.
Yes.
Okay. and it's sort of a signal to the machine actuator that it probably already exists, right? Like if that field is blank, the actuator is going to say it doesn't exist. I'll go create one and fill it in. If that field exists, then it's going to basically try to find one that already has that field set.
Yes, precisely. I mean, in fact, I mean, in the normal workflow, your actuator is the one which actually populates that field again once it has actually realized that machine. So in theory, that's the mechanism how we can keep track. Very similar to, for example, how we had this mechanism earlier using annotations. We just moved it from an annotation into the spec. So it's a little bit, I would say, slightly better. I think it may not be perfect, but that's at least the way that we came up with. That seems to be working for us. So
yeah, and I know people say that the services API isn't great, but this does kind of map pretty well to when you're requesting an externalized service in Kubernetes. If you don't specify what IP you want it to be on, then the service controller will fill one in and it puts it in the spec. And if you do put an IP that you want in the spec, then the service controller will try to honor that request, right? So it sounds sort of similar to that, where you say, I want a machine, I don't care what its provider ID is, and the actuator fills that in. Or you say, I want a machine and this is its provider ID, and the actuator tries to use the machine with that provider ID.
Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't think about that aspect yet, but yes, it's now that you have said it, seems very similar to what other parts of Kubernetes does. So yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think that's the only part of Kubernetes where we do it that way. And I know that people have mentioned that if they were to redesign the services API, it would probably look different. So I don't know exactly how it would look different, or if people have thought about that part. But that's definitely one of the API services that people think was written really early and maybe isn't a great example to follow. So while there is precedent there, I'm not sure it's precedent that we should be following, right? So I think that's worth, having a couple of people who are more familiar with that API take a look at.
Of course.
Also, the provider ID is in the node specification as well. So yeah.
Robert, can you suggest anyone that might take a look at it?
Yeah, I mean, ideally be like Tim, right? Tim Hawken is the one who wrote the services API, and I've heard him mention verbally a couple of times that he's not particularly happy with it, and he'd love to redo it, but it seems unlikely to happen since it's such a core part of Kubernetes, and it's going to be really hard to change. So, I mean, that would be the ideal thing. I think one other thing is, as we sort of get to the state where we think that our API is in pretty good shape, we probably should take it. I don't know if SIG architecture is the right place, or if there's a set of API reviewers or API consultants that we could go to say, this is what we think the API should look like. We can defend why we put these fields in these particular places, but please give us some feedback on how this fits into the Kubernetes ecosystem, because we do want it to feel like the rest of the Kubernetes APIs. And I know there's some burgeoning talks of creating a better API reviewer system from SIG architecture. And we don't necessarily need a review in the sense that this doesn't go into core, doesn't have to be approved by that set of folks, but I think it would be useful to get their feedback and make sure that they think we're headed in the right direction. And we did, when before this was published publicly, Jacob Beecham and I sat down with Tim and sort of walked through the API and definitely got some feedback from him on making sure we're headed in the right direction. So we've gotten very early feedback, but we've definitely made lots of changes since then. So it wouldn't hurt to go get some more feedback, especially as we start to hit some of these edge cases. Martin, you said something briefly before David, and I didn't quite catch what it was for the notes. Can you say it again?
Yeah, I mean, in the note, the provider config is in the specification, so it's the same project like the services as well. I'm not sure that is the correct way, but yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
So just out of curiosity, like the other cloud providers, for example, say GCE or OpenStack or any other one, like how when they create a VM or an instance on their underlying infrastructure, there must be some way they're kind of enriching the object on the cluster API side to kind of reflect that fact that this is the unique ID that have been generated. I mean, maybe folks who know more about the other providers can maybe chime in, like how is that happening? Is it just still an annotation? Because it's kind of the same idea, not very different that way.
Last I checked, it was an annotation on GC. Sorry, David, go ahead.
I was just going to affirm what you're saying. We also use an annotation. And I think we should, at some point, this is pointed out in the Git book, I think we should decide if we think it's acceptable and codify that as an expectation for consumers of the cluster API, or codify a different solution. But right now, that's the de facto standard, I think.
Yeah, I think this is one place where if everybody's using an annotation and that becomes a de facto standard, like it does kind of make sense to make that an actual field instead of an annotation. And maybe this is again like solving that problem where we wouldn't need that annotation. Jason, do you or Tim know what we do on the AWS side? Do we follow the same pattern there?
So for the AWS side, we just specify kind of a somewhat arbitrary annotation to satisfy cluster cuddle, but we do store the instance ID as part of our provider status.
Okay, so you guys have it on the status side then. So in terms of pivoting, which Siddharth mentioned earlier, are you able to then pivot that into, like from a bootstrap cluster into the cluster so that it can manage itself? Or?
Yeah, we accomplish that by applying some tags on the AWS instance so that when we go back into create, it'll attempt to query per those tags that we specify. And we use the cluster name and the machine name to help limit the instances that we return, and then that will repopulate the instance ID in the status.
Okay, cool. So you guys have solved, basically, the problem Siddharth mentioned, you guys have also solved, but in a slightly different way.
Yes.
Cool. Excellent. That's super helpful. I think it's really good to also see how different people are sort of approaching the same problem in different ways. So I think that's great. All right, so it sounds like there's a sort of counter proposal for this PR, which is instead of putting provider ID in the machine status, we should potentially look at putting it in the machine spec. So I think we should, again, not merge the PR quite yet. I don't know if someone wants to write up a short issue or short doc talking about the two different approaches and why you might want to pick one versus the other, so that we can try to move this forward. Because I do think having this field somewhere in the API is going to be helpful. And there are lots of issues people have brought up that it will help solve. It's just really more a question of which part of the API does it make sense to sit in. Is anyone interested in driving that forward? If not, I can just enqueue it for next week, and we can continue the discussion here and try to reach a resolution in this meeting. Okay. Well, if anyone does want to do that before next week, feel free to open an issue or start a doc and start trying to move it forward. If not, we'll keep using this forum to see if we can reach a consensus. In the meantime, Martin, you've got the next one, which is you're pointing at a PR to rename provider config to provider spec. I think that Daniel was working on that.
Yeah, it's been active for quite a while. So in the GCP, it was merged. PR was merged as well. So are there any blockers to having this thing there?
I didn't see any blockers. I thought Daniel wanted to try and test it, and so I got the other PR merged and I gave him some instructions, and I haven't heard back. If people are comfortable merging it before he has a chance to test it, then that's fine with me. I do think it's a good exercise to try and figure out, like, when you make this sort of change, how do we verify that it's not going to break everybody before we put it in? But I think the change is relatively innocuous. So
I agree with more testing, and I'll just point out that the Git book right now documents it, assuming this change has already been done.
All right, so you agree with more testing, but our documentation already assumes that it's in. What's your opinion on whether we should merge before or after Daniel has a chance to try it out with the GCP one?
So, I mean, it breaks anyone that's tracking master, which is probably everyone, right? I think more testing is probably worth it.
Okay, let's we can go ahead. We'll poke the PR and ask Daniel if he's had a chance to do some testing. In the meantime, so David, you got the next one, which is APIs for machine phases.
Okay, so I spent some time yesterday and today reviewing this. I'm not sure how to resolve the issue. It seems that we all agree that that it fixes the problem, but the question is it the right way to fix the problem? So without Hardik here, I don't know how far we can go down the path of resolving this. I just added a comment regarding the fact that I do think explicit fields are better than implicit checks for consumers. And that's one axis that we could evaluate this. And then I was trying to think, we have this problem with a number of open PRs and issues, similar to the annotation question earlier and the provider ID. And I was thinking, what are some different things we might require in order to determine if something should be merged? We could require users, documented users of the API. So in this case of this API, we have Gardener. They don't technically use it, but they have something that's parallel. So if we merged this PR, it would not be used, and it wouldn't be documented, which means it's maybe unlikely to start being used. So unless someone else wants to hash out whether we merge this PR or not, I think we should wait for Hardik in terms of resolving this issue. But I just wanted to put out there a question of should we require documentation changes along with API updates? And my vote for that is yes.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. And now also that we have a place to put that documentation, I think that would be sort of a good requirement to put on top of people. I think it's fair to let people create their PR without the documentation to start with, so that we can have a discussion about the PR and agree that we should move forward with it. And sort of once it passes the, yes, we think this is a good API change, then we should write documentation before we merge it. Makes a lot of sense. So I don't want people to waste a lot of time writing documentation, and then the consensus is we don't want the PR, unless the documentation is helpful for people to flush out why we want the API changes and describe that to other people. In which case, that makes sense to do that as part of the process, right? So I don't think we should require it before people create the PR and bring it to the forum, but I am in favor of requiring it before we merge the PR. Other people's thoughts?
So one question around this thing is so the node ref that we've been talking about, that is only available for the local cluster. I mean, for a remote cluster case as well, if we were to since we have the kube config for the remote cluster that has been utilized by the cluster API controllers anyways, I mean, would it be that bad of an idea to say, you know what, let's just capture the node ref, coming from that remote cluster and put it in the same place for tracking. And whenever the corresponding controller or actuator who's looking into that node or that machine, I mean, from the machine, they can see whether it's a part of which cluster, and from which cluster they can see whether it's a remote cluster or not, or some sort of a way. And then they can appropriately use the right kube config to actually resolve that node ref into the actual object if they want to do something more with it. I mean, just my thought. I don't know if there is probably some holes there that I've not thought about, but something that I bothered my mind, that maybe is it that difficult, or maybe there's some downside to that people think that it's completely a bad idea to do that.
Does a reference actually capture which cluster it belongs to?
No, it doesn't. But I actually wonder if it's the right type to be able to resolve in a remote cluster. I don't know what type it is. I don't think it's a UUID though.
I think it has like a type. I think it does have a node UUID. I think it does have the ID and the type node. But definitely it does not have the information about which cluster it is coming from. But what I'm saying is, from the machine object, which this thing is part of, from the machine object, we can always go to say which cluster this machine object belongs to. We can find that out. And from that, we potentially can figure out whether it is, something that you should be looking at local, or something that you have to connect to remotely to do things. Because the actuators are anyways who are actively, doing things on this cluster, and the objects related to this cluster are already gathering and using the the kube config for that remote cluster to do things. So it's not like something new that we'll be introducing. We just reuse what is already being used, and just maintain the node ref in the same way as, wouldn't that solve or simplify certain things, at least as part of this discussion?
I think so. I think that would make a great comment for issue 520, where we specifically talk about node refs. And then my feeling about the phases PR is that because the node ref issue exists and is broader than the phases PR, we should solve the node ref problem out of band.
Okay, I'll add my comments on the reference PRs that you mentioned. Thanks.
Did anyone else have any comments about requiring documentation for API changes, which I think was David's original point for this agenda item? Okay, I see some plus ones and various formats in chat. I think, David, it might be a really good thing to put into the Git book, sort of some of those expectations, and then we can just link PRs and say, like, hey, you need to add documentation, and put a link to where it describes what that documentation should look like in the Git book. I know this is a really good strategy people use for code reviews, when they can say, like, oh, this is a common comment for Go code reviews, and you can just point to like the standard set of like normal comments, right? So if we can put a short comment on a PR and say, like, hey, you need docs, and then we put a link into our Git book, I think that's a good way to do it, instead of trying to re-describe to everybody what we expect on every PR. All right, next, Martin has a question about adding context to actuator methods.
Yeah, so when we are talking about breaking changes, so I've been playing around with the actuator, and then I noticed that currently there's no way to actually signal to the providers if they need to cancel what they're doing. So, and for example, on the cloud provider, the cloud controller manager, the cloud interface, I think all the methods pass context already. So this is a really good practice that we probably want to adapt to.
Yes, I definitely agree. It's interesting as I'm going through some of the changes for CRDs, and you look at the kubebuilder code, all the client calls take a context, and basically all of them we just pass context.background because there's no context to plumb through the stack, which is really unfortunate. Because context.background isn't particularly useful. Like you said, you can't get tracing through your code, you can't cancel it or anything. So I think it would be awesome if we put context in the actuator methods, and it won't be immediate, but we can start like sort of plumbing that down through the actuators to when they're actually making calls. It would be good to actually start plumbing it up also, so that the rest of our code actually has contexts that are consistent through call chains. But yes, yeah, we should definitely put it in the actuator methods sooner rather than later to break people now and get them in the habit of using it.
Okay, so I'm going to open a PR because I had like a prototype here. So yeah.
And I put it in chat, but it should be context to do. Don't use context background unless you actually mean context background.
Yes, I know. All of the like auto-generated stuff from kubebuilder is context.background though, which is very surprising to me. So
I think that's pronounced PR opportunity.
I agree. Yes, context to do is the right way because that's the same thing as background, except that it lets you know that you should actually be changing it. Thanks, Justin. Siddharth, you've got the next thing, which is the last thing on the agenda. We have about 13 minutes left, so if people want to try to sneak something in at the end, please add it now. In the meantime, let's see. You want to describe what this issue 493 here, Siddharth?
Sure. So I opened this issue a while back. The basic idea is that when we define the machine spec or the machine definition, in that we can sneak in, for example, things like what kind of taints do you want, what kind of labels do you want. That's part of actually the machine object itself, not even the spec. Now the point is, even though you may specify that, those are not realized in the real world at the moment. So for example, even though you might say, oh, I want this this taint or this label on this machine when it gets created, that doesn't really happen. So as I was trying to think about some different ways, one thing that I kind of stumbled upon, and I was like, okay, maybe we can how about using, let's say, the kubelet args itself to kind of provide that. I mean, it's not the perfect way because, again, it doesn't solve the problem of what if after the fact, after the provisioning has happened, I want to modify those and then get it affected. Yeah, that doesn't solve that problem, but at least at the bare minimum, when you're bootstrapping and you're bringing up brand new nodes, I think at that point in time, at least it will be reflective of the intentions that the user wants, and we'll be able to do that properly. Does anybody see any issues with that, or I just want to gather some thoughts there?
So one concern I have with adding additional kubelet args is as part of the AWS work, we want to expose kind of the kubeadm config through our provider config. And if you can specify the kubelet args on the top level object and then also in the provider config through the kubeadm, that would require us to actually have to reconcile those two, which would cause some complications there.
Yeah, another point is that if I remember correctly, right now they are commented as intended to be applied once, and whenever a user changes or controller or whatever changes the labels and taints, the controller should not reconcile them to what's on the machine. And if you would put them as an arg on the kubelet, whenever the kubelet gets restarted, the taints and labels will there be again. And I think that's not how it's intended.
It's a very difficult thing to do once you already have a kubelet established. And percolating it to the top level API is an administrative operation that is not, I don't know how you do it in a programmatic fashion to change it on the node itself without actually having an administrative ACLs to do it, right? You're gonna have to give special privileges to the controllers in order for you to do that, which means that your controllers could pwn everything, which they probably could right now, but.
Well, speaking of security, there has been an open issue for a while that we want to stop allowing the kubelet to set its own taints and labels.
That's done. Well, within KK, it's done.
What do you mean it's done?
The kubelet can no longer only on initial startup in the kubelet set the taints and labels, and after that point, it cannot adjust them.
Sure. I thought that the open issue was that we didn't even want to let it set taints and labels on startup either.
But you could, there's so many ways to get around this with, like, you know, different ways you start up the nodes. But
well, I think the point being, like, if we don't use the kubelet args to set taints and labels, and something out of band like the machine controller is responsible for setting those things on the node, then the node doesn't even have to have the permission to be able to set its own taints and labels at all, right?
I think there is an opportunity there to, like, fix this problem, as you say, Robbie. I think one thing we definitely want to avoid is a node coming up, a node that we intend to be tainted, coming up as untainted, and then there being a window on which, let's say, user workloads land on a super privileged, secure node type thing. So we need something. It sounds like today that would be what's being suggested on this PR, where we pass in the kubelet args, but it sounds like there may be a better solution where we have I don't know, the mission controller that taints it in, I don't know, something like that, but something better. We could ask SIG, someone else. But yeah,
I think it's auth, right? Because I think that PR was opened by Mike Denise, and Jordan has been very active commenting on it. So I think they would be the right people to figure out how to do this if we care about security. If it's more a matter of we're trying to make it work because it's part of our API and it doesn't work today, then, you know, we can talk about ways we might want to do it in the short term, knowing that we need to come back and figure out the security story later. I think that might be what Siddharth is proposing, right?
Right. So essentially so what Justin said, right? I mean, we don't want, for example, especially a node that comes up without a taint that it should have come up with. I mean, at the moment, the best way, at least I know of doing that, would probably be like the kubelet args, because that's pretty much the node that comes up with that. So there is no window of opportunity there for it to miss it. Now, from the implementation side of view, I mean, anyways, right now, as things stand today, all the scripts that bootstrap these nodes, they're all provider specific. So literally every provider has to generate this script, shell script that runs inside these nodes that would bring up the kubelet and everything and set the kubelet args. So solving this problem at a generic level without involving the providers, I'm not really sure like how we would be able to do that, primarily because providers are putting it the script. But for the short term, I would say, before, I agree that maybe if there's a better way to do it, let's do that. But maybe in the shorter term, would it be a reasonable thing to say that, for each provider providers that do care about this taints and the labels to come up with, one reasonable solution would be to, within that provider code where they're creating those, taints, they can actually just make it as part of the kubelet for the time being until we get to maybe a better solution, down the way.
This features and capability already exists in the kubelet, or the inside of the kubedem configuration that'll be passed through in provider config for the AWS implementation. So you can do this today with a bunch of different providers, passing it through in provider config. I'm really reticent about the notion of making it generic within inside of the cluster API because of mutability concerns and security vulnerability issues. It would have to be specified almost as like a kubelet arg initialization something, because having it generic taints on machine implies mutability of some sorts. So like the problem is, do we have explicit non-mutable fields inside of the API? Because it should only be done once.
Agreed. I mean, I think, yes, if you were to use the kubelet arg, then that's just like the first time, one-time deal. I mean, it's not something that will, hold valid for the future lifetime of that object, because if somebody mutates that, then that's not going to get affected. But maybe if that is the case, maybe via documentation, or maybe making new fields up, which could actually mean like this is a one-time thing that you can apply to initial like bootstrapping labels and bootstrapping taints, if that makes sense. so that it's very explicit to the user, saying that this is only one-time thing that will happen. Don't expect to be able to change this later on and expect the same behavior. I don't know. Would that maybe help?
I really think we should talk to SIG auth and find out their timeline, and especially because we actually have an opportunity to offer them like a solution here, right? It is perfectly reasonable for us to write a node admission controller which adds taints and I guess it's an admission controller to prevent mutations of machine deployments, if we want to get down to the field level, or just like rely on RBAC and say it's all or nothing. I think we have. I'm not saying it's great, but I'm saying it's an approach, and if they're blocked on we don't have an approach, that might help them.
I love the idea of a node admission controller. I think that's way cleaner of a solution, and it frees up the API from not having to be burdened by this.
I suspect we'll want to put it in the API, but yeah,
it's just a mutability concern. It gets so weird, right? Like that.
So I think we would need, like, if we would need an admission controller there as well. Because, I mean, if we were using API machinery, we'd just mark the field as immutable. But I think we can do that through an admission webhook, right? I think.
Yeah, I think Daniel also had some questions about what these labels and taints meant for nodes, because if we were trying to actively reconcile these things and people were trying to change them, it would be frustrating. If other automation was trying to add labels and we were overriding those, that would be bad. And I think he proposed sort of a merge strategy. And so one question is are the fields in the machine API, should we call them like initial labels and initial taints, where we explicitly say we will apply them on startup and never reconcile them? Or are they meant to be mutable, where you could modify the machine and say, now I want this machine to have this different set of labels, and it would go and add those labels to machines that already exist, right? I think I'm not hearing sort of a consensus on exactly what we think the behavior should be yet. I think, Tim, you've said you've had some security concerns, especially with regards to taints, about changing those after the fact. I think it does make sense to have them in when I describe what a machine is and how that node should appear in the system, to put the labels and taints there, because that's like a nice declarative place to put them initially, right? And so the question is that actively reconciled or not? Like, should those fields be immutable, and should they be only applied once? That's a real question.
A pattern could be that you also declare, or an alternate pattern could be you declare the set of annotations or labels that you do want to reconcile. So you say, I own these labels, which is sort of what server-side apply is going to do, right? If I squint.
I think something like this, a cap is kind of appropriate, because we're going to have to involve multiple SIGs in this.
Maybe we should at least start by talking to SIG auth, and maybe we can get them to write up the cap.
So Siddharth, I know you brought this up. Are you interested in trying to keep driving this forward in sort of the broader conversation with SIG auth and potentially writing a KEP? Are you looking for an answer to, is it okay if the vSphere provider today just plumbs us through kubelet args, even if nobody else wants to do that while we wait for a better solution? I'm curious what you're trying to get out of your question here.
Well, my more intention was probably like the second one I said. I mean, I was trying to see if there is a solution, because this is essentially one of the need that I have, that out of this of the cluster API vSphere provider implementation that I want to have to achieve, that we get the right set of taints and labels appropriately created. So I think in the short term, I think we can probably put that in the vSphere controller code, and that could just work, at least for the time being. Now, as far as the broader conversation about solving this in a different way, I do like the idea about that the admission controller. I think that definitely has quite a lot of value, and I can probably, I'm not sure if I know the relevant people at this point in time in different SIGs, because I'm not really participating in the different SIGs altogether. really reach out. So if somebody else has a little better connection, can kick off things, I can definitely try and put in my ideas there as well and participate.
Okay. I mean, I think to answer your first part, I think using kubelet args in your provider for now to solve this problem sounds reasonable to me. I don't know that it's a pattern that we want to sort of force upon everybody and to codify and to actually resolve the linked issue. I think for that we do want to have the larger discussion. So I'd say if that unblocks you for now, that sounds reasonable. And we should also in parallel start the discussion with SIG auth. Does that sound right to everybody else?
Sounds good to me.
Sound wrong to anybody else? Okay. We are about 2 minutes over time, and we are also out of agenda items. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'll get the video uploaded ASAP, and we'll see everyone again next week. Take care.